Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Anneke Hackenbruch. I'm Vindolanda's Digitization Project Officer. And today's evening lecture will be undertaken by Rob Sands. So first of all, thank you very much for Rob Sands to actually offering to give us a talk today. So thank you very much.
No problem, Anneke.
Rob Sands is assistant professor in archaeology at the University College in Dublin. One of his main interests are portable wooden objects, and I know that he is as well a very good wood turner. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody. What you can see in this image is Vindolanda, an auxiliary fort on the northern frontier of Roman Britain. And deeply buried in various soggy parts of the site are the remains of numerous wooden objects, of which the writing tablets are the most famous. Work on the portable wooden objects, but not including the writing tablets, was initiated by Dr. John Hather, formerly of UCL, with the support of the Vindolanda Trust back in the late 1990s. As part of this project, John asked me to join him on yearly week-long visits. So we spent many happy hours like kiddies in a sweetie shop, working our way through an extraordinary collection, with John also undertaking the wood species identifications. Then, in 2002, we both had major career and life changes. So the project effectively went dormant, and in 2016, I re-entered full-time academic archaeology and used this as an opportunity to re-engage with the original work. So, over the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be giving you just a very brief flavour of this remarkable collection. A full review of the original work and some of the more recent finds is currently being prepared for publication in 2002. As many of you will know, Vindolanda is a Roman auxiliary fort approximately halfway between the modern cities of Carlisle to the west and Newcastle to the east. It was constructed in the late 1st century AD next to a strategic routeway that became known as the Staingate in later periods, and is located less than 2 kilometers to the south of what was to become Hadrian's Wall. But before we get stuck into some of the archaeological goodies, I want to make a slight segue. It may seem odd to start a presentation about the wooden materials from a Roman fort with a chair made in the 18th century, but I have my reasons. A chair such as this is a fabulous multi-part piece of work involving several skilled manufacturing techniques that took time to learn and must have been passed on across generations. If indoors and looked after, we see wooden objects survive and be used over considerable periods of time. Consider, for example, some of the wooden carving and structures we see in cathedrals today. However, from the deeper past and in less favourable conditions, wooden survival is much less likely. Essentially, for wood to survive, it must either be kept dry and protected, be deposited in frozen conditions, or become buried in damp, dark, anaerobic conditions, which is what we find at Vindolanda. Another thing to consider is that even when the right conditions are present, the chance of an object ending up in them is relatively small. The chance that that object ends up in that deposit in one piece is even smaller. As time progresses, multi-part items like this chair are likely to get broken, discarded, or even burnt as fuel. So we're much more likely to find, if at all, parts of things, and this is mostly what we see at Vindolanda. To take just a few examples, here we can see a few items from the Vindolanda collection, probably all parts of furniture of some sort. The three on the left, possibly spindles from decorative galleries, and the object on the right, probably a furniture leg, perhaps from a circular three-legged table. The fragmentation makes definitive assignment to a particular item of furniture problematical, but our understanding can be supported by more complete examples from other sites across the Roman Empire, for which the charred remains from Herculaneum and Stefan Moll's excellent volume provide an invaluable source. In addition to potential fragmentation of objects, we may also be missing other aspects. It's quite common to see archaeological remains in shades of grey and brown, especially organic materials. However, we should allow for the fact that the past could be much more vibrant and colourful. In their original state, both the natural colour of the wood, as we'll see later, or applied pigments, as we may be seeing here, could add to the aesthetics of objects, giving a completely different impression potentially to the owner and user than the one we see today. As just noted, the material from Vindolanda survives because of it having become buried in permanently damp, dark, anaerobic conditions. In this image of excavations in the 1990s, you can see the presence of larger structural timbers. So here and here, for example. And it's important to note that what we are discussing today is only the portable wooden objects. Apart from some dendrochronological analysis, a program of work on analysing the structural timbers has yet to be undertaken. You can see also that these deposits can be very deep and cover a number of phases of fort construction, deconstruction, and realignment. For the details and specifics, I would direct you to the excellent Vindolanda team and their various publications. My knowledge of the excavations over the years, while considerably improved, is still secondhand and developing. And if you were to quiz me, the very thin facade of my understanding may start to crumble. Nevertheless, over the next few slides, I'll give you a broad sense of the sequence and the location of the wooden objects. Vindolanda has undergone several changes in shape and orientation since the site was first occupied in the late 1st century AD. Most of the wooden objects come from the first few fort structures. The first fort at Vindolanda was approximately the same size as the one we see on the ground today, but with slightly different orientation. This phase was garrisoned by the first Tungrian cohort, and like all succeeding forts up until period 6, the predominant construction material was wood. Periods 2 and 3 saw an expansion and another slight realignment. These periods were garrisoned by the 9th Batavian cohort. Periods 4 and 5 saw Vindolanda expand considerably to the west and the return of the first Tungrian cohort. Period 6 saw the main fort structure shrink back to a size and orientation closer to the one we see when we visit the site today. The cohorts garrisoning the fort across these periods are a little less certain. However, the important thing from the perspective of this talk is that the bulk of the objects so far examined come from approximately the area shown in brown, so roughly there. Despite the fact that ditches were cut in this area by later forts, the deposits are deep enough that earlier phases, including the remains of wooden room divisions, survive. The preservation of organic materials on site can be excellent, but it's not equally represented chronologically. There is survival in deposits dating from around 85 AD to around 300 AD, but the majority of the wooden objects come from periods 2, 3, and 4, with over half of the objects so far examined dating to between around 100 and 120 AD, periods 3 and 4. The bulk of the material comes from a time when either the first Tungrian or the 9th Batavian cohort were in residence. Both cohorts were recruited from tribes occupying regions in northern Gaul. It's also worth remembering that every item we will look at was once part of a living tree. It grew in a treescape of some description and was at some point selected, felled, and split or sawn into parts. In other words, it will have had a journey and an existence before it even became an object. And work has been done over the years by several projects to support our understanding of the contemporary environment along Hadrian's Wall and around Vindolanda. Here is a very quick plot of some of the environmental analysis that's been done closest to Vindolanda. From these, and inevitably, debate continues as to the exact nature of the landscape and its change over time. However, very broadly and very simplistically put, the evidence so far points to quite an open landscape. The picture was possibly not entirely dissimilar from that we see today. Larger open areas, isolated trees, smaller stands, and discrete areas of woodland. This is briefly supported in one of the pieces of correspondence found on the site, which refers to the distribution of wheat to the ox herds of the wood, implying a discrete, identifiable wooded area. Species identification of objects have so far revealed a mix of trees. This is established by looking at small samples under a microscope and looking for differences in anatomical characteristics, although how closely this can be determined can vary. This work continues to be work in progress, especially as procedures and techniques have improved over the years. So some aspects may inevitably merit revisiting and checking. Nevertheless, this represents a good indication of the range of trees used to make the objects. Many of the items identified could have been produced from trees that grew locally to Vindolanda, such as oak, ash, apple, hawthorn, alder, etc. Although this does not automatically mean that they were. Some trees, such as beech, did grow in Britain, but the evidence to date indicates not as far north as Vindolanda. Other items are most likely to have been produced from trees that grew some considerable distance from the fort. So, for example, we see species such as silver fir, spruce, and larch, which are predominantly used to produce barrels in the Roman period and are not native to Britain. Although there is some evidence for the cultivation of spruce in Britain, and a cooper is mentioned as being active in Roman London, the majority, if not all, the casts at Vindolanda made from these species are likely to have been manufactured closer to the source materials, perhaps in areas such as southern Gaul. Similarly, items made from box are probably being produced by makers beyond the island, even though box would technically have been available in southern Britain. We can see that wood and wooden objects could be arriving from much further afield, and it's important to see Vindolanda as plugged into a complex, extended network over road, river, and sea, allowing for the movement of people, goods, materials, and ideas. This is perhaps illustrated by this extraordinary piece of correspondence from Vindolanda. Here we see, amongst other things, parts of carts being requested. We can see, for example, the request for an axle turned on a lathe and the need for 300 spokes. It's interesting that things like spokes could be asked for without a specification as to their dimensions, possibly indicating a sense of routine size. The request for knots that we can see in this line here is also interesting. This has been subsequently suggested to refer to bur or burlwood. And as it happens, just such an item has recently been identified at Vindolanda. Here, we see a partially prepared blank, probably either for a carved or a turned bowl. It's made from what is commonly referred to bur or burlwood. This is a natural reaction of certain trees to some form of stress, which stimulates erratic growth, forming bulges of wood in the trunk. When cut, such burrs can reveal a very swirly and aesthetically pleasing grain pattern. The exact reason why these are initiated is still a matter of debate, but probably varies from situation to situation. Importantly, we know from contemporary sources that these were aesthetically valued, and Pliny, in his natural histories, mentions citrus wood, maple, and alder in this regard, with citrus the most highly prized. The object shown here is likely to be made from an alder tree. The sight and sound of carts and other wheeled vehicles must have been commonplace at Vindolanda and would have predominantly been made of wood and various associated metal fittings. Perhaps the most recognizable element of transport we see amongst the Vindolanda objects are the individual spokes from wheels, as also mentioned in the correspondence. They have a design that is quite typical in both Iron Age and Roman contexts. Here we see an example from the Iron Age site of the Glastonbury Lake Village, which, although slightly larger in size, has many similarities in form to the Vindolanda one. They've both been turned on a lathe, and the end that would fit into the hub has quite a complex double-stacked tenon structure. Spokes also provide a good example of the issues of fragmentation and partial survival mentioned earlier. Here we see a beautifully illustrated wheel from the Northern Lanes excavations in Carlisle. I've scaled the spoke from Vindolanda to this illustration, and the form is remarkably similar, as to is the size. So you can see the spoke there. However, we can see that the total assemblages of spokes at Vindolanda is so far 27, recovered over 5 phases. If we take the Carlisle wheel as a model and imagine a wheel with a vehicle with 4 wheels, a single cart would have had 44 spokes. So a spoke found at Vindolanda must be a sample of a sample of a sample. Clearly, the roads in and out of Vindolanda were not always in the best state. On this stylus tablet, we see a familiar refrain about the state of the roads. And write to me, what is with that wagon? I would have already been to collect them, except that I did not care to injure the animals while the roads are bad. Bad roads and other wear and tear must have required running repairs, and we potentially see evidence of that amongst the wooden objects. What we're seeing here are arguably the cut ends from spokes, presumably part of dismantling wheels, possibly for repair or recycling. When I see these, I can't help hearing somebody sucking air through their teeth and exclaiming, that's going to cost you. I've been collecting together examples of these, and we may well be seeing both similar design and similar practices from different parts of the empire. One of the difficulties in finding these in different catalogues is that they may be categorized differently in the various publications. And again, problems of fragmentation and definition raise their head. So if any of you have further examples, I'd love to hear from you. Of course, repairs and making require tools and somewhere from which to work. While we do not yet have an identifiable location that we might specifically call a workshop, a wood workshop, we do have evidence of the tools that might be used in one. Here we can see what might reasonably be interpreted as the end of a small frame saw, of a form that we see elsewhere. 2 of the most complete examples come from a Roman wreck in the Netherlands. This allows us to imagine how the fragment from Vindolanda operated. A cord would be doubled between the 2 upper ends. A wooden bar was inserted between the cords such that, when turned, the cord became twisted. The twisting of the cord shortened its length and drew together the upper ends, creating tension in the blade below. There are 2 things to notice about this object in particular. Firstly, there's a great care and attention in its manufacture that extends beyond the purely functional. There's clearly pride manifest in this object. Also, if you look carefully, so just as the object starts to bend, you can see on the middle image there, a slight sheen and a smoothing of the surface. And this is probably through repeated handling and the oils in the hands being constantly used to work with this object. Here we see another woodworking tool, a wooden plane, one of a pair recovered in 2017. Quite a few planes are known from the Roman Empire, both in wood and sometimes in other materials. For those made of wood, it seems that a variety of species could be used in their manufacture. These and other tools provide the opportunity to highlight Roger Ulrich's book on Roman woodworking, a really beautifully written and invaluable source of information for anyone interested in this aspect of Roman life. Specialist studies can be a little siloed, especially on complex extended projects. And my work on the wooden objects to date suffers from this to some extent. To fully understand the woodworking practice of Vindolanda, for example, will require a much better integration with surviving tool finds than I've currently been able to achieve. However, with time, the aim is to establish a more joined up, holistic view of activity, taking into account a wide range of objects and materials. Such integration is very neatly demonstrated by Owen Humphrey's recent volume on the Roman tools from London. To take just one more unusual example from Vindolanda, Here we see a small fragment of what was probably a piece of wooden moulding, perhaps from an item of furniture. Such items could be produced with the aid of dedicated moulding planes, and at least one of these has been identified amongst them in the Vindlander ironwork. This also provides me with an opportunity to do a shout out to Rhys Williams from Teesside University and his work on 3D models of selected wooden items. In addition to being fabulous ways of viewing items, and I think you can see this one in particular as part of his collection, they also allow for additional aspects to be extracted. Here, it has allowed me to neatly take the profile for this object, as you can see in the black section there. In addition to tools, another way into understanding production is to look for the waste products of those activities. Here we see, surviving at Vindolanda, the waste product from wood turning, in this case from quarter cleft stock and probably turned on a bow lathe. Turning waste like this is not from the manufacture of bowls, but rather items such as furniture elements or the wheel spokes we have recently looked at. We see many turned items in the collection. These three examples are all probably related to textiles in some way. We can see on screen part of a needle case, a spindle whirl, and what is probably a bobbin of a form regularly found on Roman military sites where wood has survived. The needle case in particular is an exquisite example of skilled production. However, all of these objects are made of boxwood, and like the combs I will mention a little later, are unlikely to have been produced at Vindolanda, and none of the turning waste so far identified relates to the making of these kinds of objects. These have probably ultimately been derived from makers and material sources from beyond Roman Britain. Having said this, the presence of boxwood logs in a wreck found off the Italian coast does demonstrate the movement of raw boxwood. So it should be considered at least possible that the raw material was being moved, perhaps ending up in larger centres further north. The items we so far considered speak to woodworking specialisms: the wheelwright, the furniture maker, the wood turner, all of which rely on practice, the transfer of knowledge, and a high level of embodied cognition. Not all woodwork at Vindolanda was like this, and we also see less specialist production. Several guy rope pegs, for example, probably related to tents, have been found. So far, all made of oak. They vary in style, and the suggestion might be that these are the products of multiple hands. The recent excellent publication of material from the early Roman fort of Velsen I by Silke Lang discusses one of the largest collections of these items. The Velsen collection includes even more variation in style and shows a preference for the use of ash. Actually, the examples of Vindolanda have also recently been the focus of study by Annika, so if you have any questions about these, ask Annika. Wood and wood products would have been fundamental to all aspects of daily life at Vindolanda. Unsurprisingly, items related to food, preparation, and its consumption appear relatively regularly in the assemblage. Both vessels and utensils of various forms are present. Some have a more unusual form, such as the scoop on the right, while others, such as the spatula shown in the middle, would not look out of place in our own kitchens. The items shown on screen are all made of woods that were available locally and could have been produced on site. Although, of course, as I said earlier, we should not assume that they were. While many of the items that can be assigned to food preparation are made from locally available woods, not all are. This is another object made from boxwood, and like other items made from this material, the current thinking is that it's arriving at the fort in its finished form. It's of a type that we see on other Roman sites and may have had a particular function within the Roman kitchen. Box is also fine-grained, taint-free wood, so wood would have been a good choice in this context. This also provides an opportunity to direct you to another very useful volume if you're interested, Paolo Pugs's Roman Domestic Wood. Of course, all sorts of goods had to be transported in some way, In addition to pottery vessels, we see the remains of wooden barrels at Vindolanda. In our mind's eye, and indeed our mind's ear, we can see and hear the fort as a vibrant, complex community with people, goods and materials arriving and departing on a regular basis, with all of the hustle and bustle that would have been involved. And arriving through the fort gates on the backs of the carts we previously discussed earlier must have been barrels. Once at Vindolanda, it's clear that barrels were regularly reused to make other things, a point really well made and illustrated by Damien Goodburn in relation to barrels arriving into Roman London. Some of the barrels could be very large, 2 meters or more in height, and perhaps over 1 meter in diameter at their girth. Inherent in their bellied form is a sense of movement, being able to be rolled and rotated in a way that their bulk does not immediately suggest. And they were objects that for much of their core existence were in motion. However, we can imagine that barrels had an extensive, complex and extended life. From their original production, to their multiple owners and users, to their repair and ultimately reuse and recycling, as clearly seen in Roman London and at Vindolanda. The consideration of these complex biographies is the subject of a 2020 paper by myself and Elise Marlier in the European Journal of Archaeology. So you can read more about this there. This work also builds on Elise's fascinating and extensive research into Roman barrels across the empire, and Damien Goodburn's excellent work on the Cooper materials from London. The next object we'll look at neatly combines both cooperage on the one hand and the food and drink theme on the other. What you can see here are the remains of wooden stave-built tankards, some of which could hold up to 4 pints. Again, what we're left with is only the individual disarticulated parts. The reconstruction here is rather plain, but this probably says more about my artistic abilities than it does about the original object. When new, many of these would have had a very pleasing look indeed, combining fine woodworking with copper alloy fittings. Freshly produced, the orange to red colour of the wood would have perfectly offset the golden colour of the copper alloy. Even the base of the tankard indicated quality, often decoratively turned. Perhaps importantly, this quality would have been more apparent to somebody else when the tankard was being raised. This is part of a tradition of production that emerges in the late Iron Age and has largely been found in Britain. The Vindolanda items were the subject of a paper by myself and Jonathan Horn in the Oxford Journal of Archaeology in 2017. So you can read more about these there and in Jonathan's review of these items across Britain and Ireland in his Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society paper in 2015. Since our paper was written, I've identified more parts from these items and across multiple phases. So importantly, this was clearly part of the material culture of the fort and embedded into the fabric of social practices. During these times, we can imagine toasts being raised to successful campaigns of fallen comrades, talk being had, memories evoked, deals being made, games being played, scores settled, money lent and borrowed, and the ebb and flow of the life at the fort being played out. We can also see other wooden items being important at an individual level. Perhaps the most pleasing are the combs, small, personal, regularly used items. These were probably manufactured by dedicated comb makers beyond Britain and closer to the source of quality boxwood. And you can find more about these in recent research and publications by Barbara Burley. We can see similar personal items in the form of a number of wooden shoes. What I like about these is that on a number of examples, you can clearly see differential wear as the wood has worn to reflect the gait of the individual. Some are more basic in form, while others, like the example on the left, has been given much more care and attention in production. These also remind me of the aspect we are often missing when we consider the past. As I look at these, I can almost hear the click, clack sound of somebody approaching across a stone floor when I see them. Now, in a slightly awkward segue, we can, speaking of sound, some other themes are just beginning to emerge. This small item, for example, may be a rare survival of a wooden mouthpiece for a musical instrument, and again speaks to an element of the past that we don't often necessarily consider. And this is of a form more regularly encountered in metal. This is the basis of an ongoing and very enjoyable discussion I'm having with Angela Wardle, whose PhD this illustration of the metal example from the British Museum is derived. Some items we're seeing may relate to aspects of play. We know that children are present on the fort, so we might expect at least some parts of the assemblage to reflect that. Here we can see what may be a spinning top. It is similar to items interpreted this way in places like Viking Dublin. We can also see a small, and in quotes, toy dagger, although it's worth remembering that play may have had a more serious purpose at this time and place. Without getting too Rumsfeldian, we also have known unknowns. In any assemblage, there are objects that do not neatly fit. Shown here is a reoccurring form of Vindolanda, for which there are close parallels in other assemblages across the empire. In most catalogues, they either end up being described as a peg or in the miscellaneous category. This makes text searches hard, and they really only jump out in well-illustrated publications or in online collections with good photographic or illustrative support. There's clearly a repeated form here, suggesting a repeated need over time. These were arguably things that were easily recognizable to somebody living at Vindolanda, even if they're not to us and other Roman sites. We do see similar examples from other sites in Britain and beyond, such as this example from Dasgetium, Switzerland. They remain, however, a little bit of an enigma to us. One thought that I keep returning to is their possible use as a shoe tree, helping the toe end of a leather shoe keep its form and remaining damp-free when not in use. Given the quantity of leather shoes on the site, this remains a possibility, but only a possibility. Proving it is almost impossible. So suggestions, gratefully received. So we can think of those last examples as the known unknowns, in as much as we have repeated examples of something that clearly is an identifiable thing. However, there also remains one-off items, and these still puzzle me. This is just one example. It's beautifully made from boxwood. It's clearly intended to articulate with other elements. We can see at the left-hand side a circular hole partially surviving that would have received something, perhaps this pivoting around it, and another hole there. The upper surface is split, so we're missing something from the upper surface, and the lower surface is broadly complete. So this dog leg here and this slope is as it would originally have been. Although, of course, I may have got the whole thing upside down, because I really have no idea what it is. So, answers on a postcard, please. I've not so far made much of the spatial patterning of objects, and this is because it's still work in progress. Here we can see a floor plan of some of the surviving wooden structures from period 3, and you can see the extraordinary detail that has survived. The spatial information from earlier excavations is still being assessed, and it really awaits to be seen whether anything meaningful can be said from the final resting place of the objects. Remember, they may have moved about, and working out exactly where they came from and exactly how they were originally used, and whether the final context fits with their original use is something that takes a while to work out. So, finally, to bring this together a little, I'll draw out some themes. Broadly, I'm interested in exploring how we understand the way an object comes into being from its nascent form, locked inside a tree, within a treescape, to its emergence as an object, its subsequent use, and its final discard. There's also a need to understand how and where more complex production occurs, the nature of the workshop, the underlying craft traditions, and how skill acquisition was occurred and was transferred. Some of these objects have complex lives and uses, and considering the extended biography of objects, such as reuse, adaptation, and recycling, provides an important focal point. Across all of this is a requirement to better understand the nuanced interplay of practice, practicality, aesthetics, tradition, and symbolic value. And in summing up, it's important to note that work such as this relies heavily on really excellent work produced by others, of which just a few examples are presented here and through this presentation. All of these publications and various people have provided invaluable sources and conversations, and I'm hugely grateful to them and to their excellent publications. And finally, some acknowledgements. No work is ever a solo effort, and I'd particularly like to thank my original collaborator and indeed the instigator of this project, John Howther, the Vindolanda Trust, particularly Barbara Burley, curator at Vindolanda, Andrew Burley, current CEO of the Trust, and Patricia Burley, and of course Robin Burley, former CEOs of the Trust. Most recently, collaboration with Annika, who is currently working on a project to provide digital access to the wooden collection, has been super valuable and continues to be so. The staff, excavators, and volunteers I've met over the years have also made my occasional trips over really enjoyable, and the conversations we have had have been excellent. And finally, of course, support from UCD School of Archaeology and UCD College of Social Sciences and Law. Thank you for listening, and any questions?